In this video, you will be introduced to the principles behind the milestones and the milestone selling system. Different companies or sales organizations have various ways of handling sales process. Some organizations use several different methods to direct their sales force and to keep track of the perhaps many sales processes within the organization. Very often, these methods involve ways of honoring and rewarding the salespeople when they reach the desired targets. To this end, some use long-term sales quotas, which often involves a yearly target. The problem with this type of sales management is that the reward or bonus that the salespeople have to look forward to if they reach their goals is way too far out in the future. The consequences of this is a lack of motivation within the sales force because the payoff is difficult to spot. You might think that this problem could then be solved by using short-term sales quotas instead. And while it may feel very tangible and very easy to measure, when you have a monthly or maybe a weekly sales target, this also presents a problem. The problem is that you make your sales team focus solely on the short-term success, which makes new and future business a low priority. Some sales organizations also choose to measure the activities of the salespeople, keeping track of the number of sales calls, customer interviews, etc. The problem here is that activities in themselves are not results, and when you measure activities instead of results, you get activities instead of results. In order to get a better overall view of the various possible deals, some sales managers use a pipeline or forecasting report for each salesperson. What leads does the salesperson have? When does he or she expect the deals to close? And what is the probability for them to close? The problem with this form of forecasting, though, is that this is just a static screenshot of a pipeline, in which you're presented with expected closing dates, which will almost always be postponed, and probabilities that are solely based on the gut feeling of the individual salesperson. But if all these ways of managing sales are flawed in one way or another, then what do you do? How do you measure if the value of your pipeline is increasing and whether or not the leads are moving in the right direction? Well, the idea behind the milestones is to view the sales process as a pipeline, which has been flipped onto its side. This can be an example of a sales process containing different sales phases. Now we will turn this into a cascading budget and use a 50% conversion rate between each phase. Now, if you have a monthly sales quota of 100,000 and a salesperson has reached 120,000 in closed deals, then he or she has of course exceeded the quota and will be seen as a success. But there is more to it than this, because if the monthly quota is 100,000 and the conversion rate from the offer phase to the deliver phase is 50%, it means that every time you succeed with 100,000, you also lose 100,000. This means that to reach the goal for 100,000, we actually use 200,000 from the offer phase. 100,000 to success and 100,000 to failure, if we say that the conversion rate is 50%. This means that in the same month that we move 100,000 from the offer phase to the deliver phase, we need to move 200,000 to the offer phase from the present phase. And again, with the 50% conversion rate in mind, 400,000 from the interview phase, 800 from the schedule phase, and 1.6 million from the qualify phase. This we have to do because in order to close deals, we need to have enough leads in our pipeline to get there. Here we can see that this particular salesperson has reached his or her quota and has actually exceeded it with 20%. But what we can also see is that in the previous phases, the results are not that great. In fact, this salesperson is not doing very well in the first phases. For example, we can see that from the interview phase to the present phase, the salesperson is supposed to move 400,000 worth of leads, but he or she has only moved 60,000. The same goes for the previous phase where the salesperson has not moved sufficient leads either. Even though the salesperson has met the goals for this month, the poor results in the first phases will be a problem later. This is because the salesperson has focused so much attention on closing this deal that he or she has forgotten to also focus on moving other potential deals through the sales process. This means that it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to reach any of the goals in the coming months and quarters, since there are not enough leads to follow up on. And this is part of the principles behind the milestone system. It's like the law of the farm. If you want to harvest, you need to sow and water and fertilize. This is where the milestone selling system comes into play. The system is built up just like the cascading budget that we saw before. The white squares represent the many leads that need to be moved from phase to phase and in the end become new orders. When a salesperson then moves a lead from one phase to another, in this case from phase 2 to phase 3, the value of this lead is registered on the milestone between these two phases, making the value on this particular milestone rise from 30% to 40%. This happens because the salesperson needs to move 800,000 across this milestone, and by moving this lead, which at this point has a value of 80,000, across the milestone, he or she is now closer to achieving this goal. The same goes for the other phases. Constantly moving leads across the milestones and through the sales process increases the value of each phase and therefore also the value of the entire pipeline. This also means that the individual salesperson can easily keep track of his or her pipeline and see at what stage they need to focus their attention in order to stay ahead. It also means that the motivation is greater because you get to celebrate the early victories. For example, when you reach or exceed the quota of the first milestone, already at that point you know that you are well on your way to reaching the goals in the next stages as well. It also gives the sales manager an easy way of keeping an overall view of the different sales processes in the organization. By monitoring the different milestones, it's easier to see if a salesperson is struggling, at what stage in the process the problems arise, and how to approach it. Now you're familiar with the principles behind milestone selling. If you want more detailed information about the principles behind the system, you can download the free ebook at leadyourleads.com.